In a village where every whisper finds an ear and every secret has a name, she arrived without luggage, without stories, and without a past. They called her Evelyn Ward, but no one knew who had first spoken that name. A week later, she collapsed beneath the bunting at the village fete, dead before her 25th birthday, a smile on her lips, and a truth buried deeper than her grave. And Miss Marple? She knew one thing for certain: silence, when chosen, is far more dangerous than anything ever said. Miss Marple was not a woman prone to fanciful thoughts, but even she would later admit that something about that particular June afternoon had struck her as peculiar from the outset. The breeze that rustled the edges of her rose arch was soft, yet oddly chill beneath the sun, as if it had traveled from some distant place where things were not so still. She stood with her secrets in hand, trimming back a wayward bud of Albertine, when she paused and looked toward the vicarage lane. It was not the wind nor the silence. It was the way silence settled that made her look up. There are silences in village life that carry the scent of routine. A quiet post-lunch hour, a respectful moment outside the church gate, or the piece of needlework shared in company. But this was different. Something was being held back by the air itself. Miss Marple, though outwardly focused on the pruning of her roses, felt it like one senses a forgotten kettle coming slowly to the boil. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken. Later that same day, word reached Miss Marple that Margaret Topham, the vicar's niece, had brought a guest with her from London. No one had seen the young woman arrive, not the grocer's lad, who prided himself on knowing every passing face, nor Mrs. Price, who lived directly opposite and fancied herself something of a gatekeeper for the vicarage comings and goings. And yet there she was, seated quietly in the pew the following Sunday morning, her hands folded, her head bowed, her eyes distant. She was introduced in minimal terms as Miss Evelyn Ward, recently returned from India, following the loss of her father. That was all. She did not offer more, and when spoken to, her replies were polite, brief, and never more than necessary. There was nothing Univille in her manner, only an almost ghost-like reticence, a stillness that unsettled. It was as though her presence had slipped between the lace curtains of the village's social fabric, without truly entering. At tea with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple heard the first quiet remark. "Pretty enough, girl. But there's something not quite present about her, don't you think?" Miss Marple, who had only glimpsed the girl from a distance at that point, murmured something noncommittal, and added a lump of sugar to her tea. But she remembered the girl's face, pale with eyes too old for 24, and how she had looked not at, but through the garden wall. By the following Saturday, the annual fed had drawn out the usual bunting, the vicar's jam stall, and a mild competitive spirit among the local flower arrangers. Miss Marple, who always judged the Victoria sponge competition with tact and a commendable impartiality, sat beneath the striped tent sipping barley water when she saw Evelyn again. The girl was walking alone, carrying a small paper parasol despite the intermittent clouds. She spoke to no one, though many attempted pleasantries. Her silence was not rude, merely expectant, as though she were waiting for something invisible to arrive. Villagers noticed, of course, they always did. Mr. Merivale, polishing the silver at the croquet table, said she looked like a girl in a painting, one of those pre-Raphaelites, tragic and wilting. Young Ivy Withers whispered that Evelyn had been standing too long near the war memorial, just gazing. Miss Marple, from beneath her hat, took note of how the girl refused lemonade, touched no sweets, and seemed to flinch when the choir boys passed too close. She held her parasol tightly in both hands, even though the wind had stilled. It was just past 4 o'clock when the faint sound of commotion rose near the jam stall. Miss Marple, still seated and quite calm, turned slightly and saw a small knot of people gathering beside the flower display. At the center of the group, collapsed like a drop-cloth doll laying Ward. Her parasol had snapped beneath her, and a white lily from the nearby stall had fallen across her dress like a theatrical touch. There was no scream, no dramatic gasp, only the dull sound of chairs scraping, the low voices of concern, and the vicar's call for Dr. Partridge. Miss Marple did not rush forward. She observed the reactions instead. Margaret Topham's face had turned not white but green. The Withers twins had already begun whispering. Mrs. Price was pushing through with vinegar. And Evelyn, she did not stir. The doctor arrived promptly, but there was no pulse. Her eyes, when gently lifted, did not blink. The fete, stunned into immobility, quietly began to fold up its laughter. By evening, word had spread. The girl had died of a heart condition, congenital, the doctor said, and likely worsened by heat and fatigue. There was talk of fainting spells, of a delicate constitution. Margaret was too shaken to speak, but confirmed Evelyn had complained of dizziness days before. At the vicarage, the tone was one of hushed sympathy. Such a sad thing, they said. Such a gentle girl. Miss Marple, while offering her condolences with measured sincerity, noticed that nobody had asked what the girl had been doing before the fed, or why her hands had no sign of tremor, or why a young woman, barely 24, would look quite so finished with life. Miss Marple did not attend the small memorial held the following day, citing a touch of arthritis. Instead, she remained in her parlor, sifting through memories of that quiet figure with the parasol. One small thing continued to trouble her. Not a clue, perhaps, but a displacement. Evelyn had carried no handbag, not at the fete, not in church, not even when introduced at tea. Miss Marple thought of the dozens of girls she had known over the years. Nieces, neighbors, former pupils. All of them, even the most modest, carried something. A reticule, a clutch, a pocketbook, a handkerchief. It was a matter of custom, practicality, identity. And yet, Evelyn had none. No visible bag, no gloves, no letter, no mirror, no powder, no keys. It was a detail so ordinary in its absence that no one else had remarked upon it. But to Miss Marple, who had once solved a robbery based solely on the whereabouts of a misplaced knitting needle, it was the first quiet bell of something quite out of place. She folded her hands over her lap and looked toward the rose arch. The wind had returned, cooler now, brushing against the glass with the softest of insistence. Something she thought had been left unsaid, not by Evelyn, but by those still talking. The vicarage drawing room was full by 3. The chairs had been arranged in a gentle arc around the hearth, though no fire burned in the late summer warmth. Tea was poured in the best china, Margaret's wedding gift set, which she insisted upon even for such impromptu gatherings, and plates of sponge cake, slightly overdone at the edges, were passed with delicate awkwardness. It was the first occasion since the fete that several of the village ladies had come together in one sitting. Miss Marple accepted her second cup with a quiet word of thanks and looked around with that gentle knitting, while listening expression which had long since become her shield. She did not speak first. She never needed to. It was Mrs. Price, her voice full of hesitation delicately arranged to sound like concern, who broke the silence. Such a shame about the young woman. So terribly sudden. One moment standing beneath the bunting, and the next, well, she trailed off, allowing the weight of implication to finish the sentence. Mrs. Wetherb, who prided herself on her discretion, nevertheless leaned in. They say she was very quiet. Not quite the thing, really. One always hopes a guest will make herself agreeable. Her gaze flickered toward Margaret Topham, who, though still pale, maintained the composed smile of one who had learned long ago how to be dignified in discomfort. They are saying she never spoke much at all, murmured Ivy Withers, who was too young for such company, but invited all the same due to her mother's recent operation. Only when spoken to, and even then. Miss Marple placed her cup upon its saucer with a soft clink. In that moment, as the talk turned softly speculative, she knew the nature of the hour had changed. Grief was receding. Curiosity had taken its place. It was not quite malice that drove the Ville's imagination, but something older, something shaped by propriety, tradition, and the instinctive discomfort of the unexplained. When Margaret Topham was asked gently whether Evelyn had been a family friend, a relation, or merely an acquaintance, her answer was characteristically noncommittal. "We met on the voyage home," she said, stirring her tea with precise movements. She had nowhere in particular to go, and as we had got on quite well aboard ship, I thought it only decent to offer her a room for a little while. Naturally, I informed the vicar. No one openly challenged her, but the words were too well formed, the timing of the answer too rehearsed. Mrs. Price exchanged a glance with Mrs. Bantry. "You must be very charitable," said Miss Hartnell mildly, "to take someone in without knowing much of her background. One doesn't see it often these days." Margaret's composure held. We spoke often on deck. She had lost her father quite recently, and seemed rather at a loss. I thought of the Christian thing. "Yes," murmured Miss Marple, almost to herself. "One forgets how much of a person's life can be left behind at sea." The silence that followed was not accusatory, but it was heavy with suggestion. Evelyn Ward had arrived without context, and in a village like St. Mary-me, that was nearly the same as arriving without a name. That very afternoon, as the women sipped the last of their tea, young Peter Houston came rushing to the vicarage gate, his muddy knees betraying a less than reverent search through the hedgerow. Clutched in his grubby hand was a small object gleaming dully in the sunlight, a silver locket, the hinge slightly dented, the chain broken. "I found it by the fate grounds, miss," he said breathlessly to Margaret, who had come to the door, "right where the jam stall was. I think it's hers, the quiet lady who fell." Margaret took it without comment, though her fingers trembled faintly. Miss Marple, who had followed slowly behind, asked in a tone as gentle as any parish aunt, "Might I have a look?" The locket was plain, unadorned, save for a delicate floral etching around the edge. Inside it held a single photograph, faded, sepia-toned, of a young girl, perhaps 5 years old, standing stiffly beside a seated woman whose face was mostly turned away. There was no inscription, no date. "Well now," murmured Mrs. Bantry, appearing over Miss Marple's shoulder, "that's a curious sort of keepsake. Not the kind one wears for show. Sentimental value, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and rather personal, wouldn't you say? The sort one tucks inside rather than displays. I wonder why it was in the hedge." Peter looked sheepish. "I thought maybe it fell when she dropped, when she fainted, but it wasn't on the ground. It was hidden, like someone had pushed it under." The room stilled. Margaret closed the locket quietly and slipped it into her apron pocket. "I'll see that it's kept safe," she said almost inaudibly. Later that evening, as Miss Marple walked home via the green, she paused by the war memorial, its inscription softened by the moss of decades. There she encountered Mr. Arnold from the grocer's, leaning on his bicycle, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Sad business, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his cap. "Funny thing, I saw her here. The girl, I mean, evening before the fete, just standing like not praying, just watching." "You're sure it was her?" Miss Marple asked. "Quite pale little thing, had that same paper parasol. I was closing up the shop, and she was just there. Gave me a fright if I'm honest. Looked like one of those old ghosts they talk about on the wireless. She did not speak, not a word. I thought perhaps she was grieving. Lost someone in the war maybe. But she was too young." Miss Marple looked toward the stone, her gaze lingering on a particular name etched there. A Captain Lee. No relative of hers, but a name she remembered from past conversations. She nodded slowly. "Sometimes," she said, "people go where the silence speaks more than words can." The following afternoon, with the clouds hanging low and the rain threatening a return, Miss Marple found herself at the Bantrys once again. Mrs. Bantry, never one to shy away from a little drama, poured generously from a second pot of derriling and leaned forward with a gleam in her eye. "You mark my words, Jane," she said. "That girl was involved in something scandalous. Not criminal, mind you, but scandalous. There's a difference. A young lady doesn't return from India alone without family and stay utterly mute unless something has gone dreadfully wrong." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I rather fancy she had her heart broken," Mrs. Bantry continued. "Or perhaps there was a child. It's always one of the two. You remember Clarissa Winter disappeared to Cairo and came back with a different surname and a suspicious cough. Same air about her. That terribly still sort of grief." "You are assuming romance," Miss Marple said gently. "My dear Jane, when a woman walks through life like a shadow, there's always a man at the center of it." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, as if considering, and yet she said not all shadows are cast by others. Some are chosen. It was only that evening as Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, with her knitting half forgotten in her lap, that a most peculiar thought took root. All day she had listened. She had heard the theories, the assumptions, the chatter. She had even heard several speak of Evelyn Ward with confidence, as though the girl's identity had always been understood. But not one person, not even Margaret, had ever said how they knew her name. She had not signed the fate registry. The vicar's announcements had not included it, and there had been no formal letters addressed to her in public view. Miss Marple reviewed the facts as one might count stitches. A quiet girl introduced, but not properly named. A locket hidden in the hedge. A photograph without clarity. A solitary figure standing before the names of the dead. And then she saw it, clear as a dropped stitch against cream wool. It wasn't what Evelyn had said. It was what she had never said at all. The name Evelyn Ward had been accepted like a polite nod passed from person to person, unquestioned and unconfirmed. But in a village that measured character by the firmness of a handshake and the reliability of Sunday appearances, such an omission was as loud as a cry. Miss Marple folded her hands and looked toward the window. Somewhere far off, a bell was ringing the hour, and she thought, not without sorrow, how very easy it was to slip into a community without anyone ever truly knowing you were there. The name was spoken quietly, as though it might slip from memory again if said too loudly. Evelyn Ward. It appeared first on the doctor's certificate, then again in a modest announcement, penned by the vicar, and placed discreetly in the parish bulletin. No further details were added, no mother's maiden name, no known address, no mention of kin. It was Margaret Topham who had offered the confirmation. She told me as much when we met. She said in the cool matter-of-fact tone that suggested she preferred questions to remain rhetorical. Evelyn Ward. She lost her father a few months ago in India and had come back rather aimlessly. Poor thing. The villagers accepted it, as they did most things, politely, with a nod and a murmur, and the private understanding that further inquiry would be, if not unkind, then at least distasteful. But Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know the danger of names spoken in isolation, wondered at the neatness of it. Evelyn Ward, a name easy to forget, and perhaps for that reason, easy to assume. Names she knew were not always beginnings. Sometimes they were endings. It was at the vicarage over a modest supper and in the softest of candlelight that Margaret at last spoke of their voyage. We were assigned the same table in the dining saloon, she said. She wasn't talkative, but I took a liking to her, quiet, well-mannered, not especially sociable, but there was something gentle about her. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, and she had no family waiting. None that she mentioned. She said she'd been abroad most of her life, boarding schools, missionaries, governesses. Her father was in trade, I believe. Something to do with cotton or steel. She didn't seem terribly proud of it. Was she ill on the voyage? Margaret hesitated. Number not ill, just thin, worn. She looked like someone who had forgotten what rest felt like. When we docked at Southampton, she seemed quite lost. I offered her a room. It was no great trouble, and she accepted. Yes, rather too quickly, if I'm honest. She didn't even ask what it would cost. Margaret looked briefly embarrassed. I never intended to charge her, but still, it was odd. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. People returning home often forget that England, too, has its prices. In a village such as St. Mary, correspondence was both habit and ritual. Letters were read at breakfast, replied to after luncheon, and sometimes saved for the afternoon post as an excuse to walk past the groceress and observe who was buying sardines on a Tuesday. It was, therefore, all the more curious that Evelyn Ward had neither sent nor received a single letter during her brief stay. Miss Marple made the observation with her usual mildness over tea with Mrs. Price, who had taken it upon herself to manage the vicarage linens, while Margaret remained in mourning. She had nothing in her room, Mrs. Price said with a frown. No postcards, no scribbled notes, not even a shopping list. I changed the bin in every guest room, and hers was always empty. And no visitors? Miss Marple asked. None. Not a one. Miss Marple considered this in silence. Even the most reserved young women wrote something, if only to the post office, about her misplaced trunk. But Evelyn had written nothing, as though there were no one to write to. Or worse, as though writing might have brought something nearer she meant to avoid. The appearance of Captain Ambrose Lee was not accompanied by warning or ceremony. He arrived one damp afternoon in a taxi from a station carrying a leather valve and an expression of startled urgency. The vicar whose door he first knocked upon sent him at once to Miss Marple with a look that said, "This is no longer my domain." He was a tall man, graying at the temples with the look of someone who had once been commanding, but now found himself profoundly lost. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, standing in Miss Marple's parlor with damp cuffs and shaking hands. "But I saw the name in the announcement. Evelyn Ward, 24, returned from India. I believe she was my fiancée." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Do sit down. She had written to me," he went on before she left. "Said she was coming home, that her father had passed. We'd planned to meet in London." His voice broke slightly. "I never expected. Did she give you an address?" He looked ashamed. "Only that she was staying with a friend in the country. I was delayed with a commission review, and then I saw the notice." Miss Marple studied him gently. "You cared for her very much, and I don't understand why she never wrote again." Captain Lee sat in Margaret Topham's parlor, pale and blinking, as she poured him tea with the mechanical grace of one determined not to feel. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "She never mentioned you." "She wouldn't have lied." He insisted. "We met in Bombay. She was assisting with a hospital dispensary. We weren't demonstrative, but we made plans, quiet ones. She was shy. There were no letters," Margaret replied. "No mention of an engagement, no ring." "There was a ring," he said. "An opal set in gold. My mother's. She said she would wear it once she settled." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, watched the exchange without intrusion. No ring had been found, no photograph of him, no letter, no card, no date circled on the calendar. And yet the man's grief seemed genuine, and his confusion palpable. If he had come seeking to deceive, he had come poorly prepared. Outside, the rain pressed gently against the windows. The silence in the room deepened, not with anger, but with the collective realization that someone had known Evelyn in a way none of them had. And yet she had not brought even that connection with her. It was the locket that brought the thoughts full circle. Miss Marple sat in her garden that evening, her shawl over her shoulders, and her cup cooling in her lap as the scent of the roses mingled with the faint earthy promise of rain. The photograph inside the locket, faded, imprecise yet intimate, had spoken of a child, a woman, and a bond that Evelyn had carried close and chosen never to explain. Captain Lee's voice still echoed faintly in her memory. She said she felt invisible, not unloved, just never seen properly. Margaret's voice had held a different chord entirely. She accepted help without hesitation, as though she expected it to come from strangers, not friends. In each account, Evelyn appeared as a woman composed of fragments, a passenger, a house guest, a ghost of an engagement. She had shared only what could be safely misunderstood. Miss Marple reflected on the parasol the girl had carried at the Fed. A flimsy thing with a painted floral motif, meant more for decorations than protection. And yet she had clutched it tightly as though it stood between her and the world. Some sorrows, Miss Marple thought, are born not because they are too large to share, but because they are too fragile. Evil Ward had returned to England not to begin a new life, but perhaps to say goodbye to one. A girl who had spent her life belonging to no one place, no one person, had tried quietly to anchor herself in memory, only to find that memory too could be lost. She rose slowly, folding her shawl more tightly. The roses bowed their heads in the dusk, and Miss Marple felt the story forming. Not yet in facts, but in feeling, and feelings, as she well knew, were often the first truth to surface. Dr. Partridge had always held Miss Marple in a degree of amused affection. She rarely came to him for herself. Her health was sturdier than her lace cuffs might suggest, but she often brought him jars of jam, or the kind of questions that seemed innocuous until one looked back on them later. That morning she brought quince jelly and a polite query. "I was thinking about the Fed," she said, seated across from his worn mahogany desk, "and how dreadful it was for poor Evelyn Ward. I wonder had she ever come to see you during her stay?" Dr. Partridge shook his head. "Not formally. Margaret mentioned once she'd had a fainting spell the week before, but the girl herself never consulted me. No mention of breathlessness, palpitations, none. Frankly, I was surprised by the diagnosis myself. Her coloring, her pulse, they gave no indication of a heart defect. But then, one can't see everything from the outside. No, Miss Marple murmured. One rarely can. He opened his patient ledger, more from courtesy than conviction. There was no entry under ward, no prescriptions, no notations. Miss Marple thanked him, complimented the garden chrysanthemums, and left. And as she walked down the gravel path, she thought to herself, it was not that the girl had hidden an illness. It was that she had never claimed one at all. The church sacristy held the soft scent of wax and age-old paper. It was a quiet space used more for vestments and ledgers than reflection. But Miss Marple found its intimacy helpful. She greeted the sacristan, Mr. Becraftoft, with familiar warmth, and inquired, quite naturally, whether Evelyn Ward had taken confession. Mr. Beechcraft was a fastidious man who had dusted candlesticks with the same reverence for 40 years. He frowned. She did come, he said. Not for confession, mind you. We don't require it formally in the parish, but she lit a candle. 3, actually, stood there for a very long while. I remember because she'd placed a paper parasol against the rail. Unusual object in a church. Was she alone? Yes. It was Wednesday morning, very still. She didn't speak to anyone, but she left a 5-shilling note in the poor box. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And did she return? Number that was the only time. He hesitated then, as if something had occurred to him, but slipped just out of reach. She looked as though she was waiting, he said at last. Not for anyone to arrive, but for something to pass. Miss Marple thanked him and left with a thoughtful expression. Lighting 3 candles was a symbol, one often used by women for mother, child, and memory. But whose? The postmistress, Miss Luring, was a woman of steely reserve and excellent memory. Miss Marple timed her visit carefully, mid-morning, when the pension checks had been sorted, but before the midday collection. Over a shared appreciation of new tea bags, still regarded with suspicion by half the village, Miss Marple raised her query. Yes, said Miss Luring, adjusting her spectacles. Miss Ward did receive one letter about 10 days before the Federal. Do you recall the return address? Somewhere in Hampshire, a market town, Alton, I believe. Handwritten, manuscript. Neat, not businesslike. Did she post any replies? Not through this window, and I would have noticed. She had a rather distant air. Miss Marple nodded. Was she the kind to ask about telegrams or discreet forwarding? Miss Luring gave her a sharp look. She did ask whether items could be held for collection if one were avoiding one's lodgings. I explained we were not that sort of office. And how did she react? She smiled faintly, said it didn't matter, but she didn't smile with her eyes. That detail, Miss Marple knew, mattered more than the envelope. Evelyn had expected news, perhaps dreaded it, and when it came, it had been delivered, but not answered. At the vicarage, Miss Marple asked gently as always if she might speak to Mrs. Plowman, the housekeeper. Margaret was absent, attending to a parish luncheon, and the old house carried the sort of hush that made confessions easier. Mrs. Plowman was reluctant at first, not due to disloyalty, but because she had been a housekeeper too long to speak freely. Still, Miss Marple's presence, with its calm certainty, loosened her tongue. I heard them once, she said, not shouting, whispering. Near the upstairs landing, Evelyn and Miss Margaret. It was late 11. And what did they say? I couldn't catch the words, just the tone. Miss Evelyn sounded like she was pleading, not loud, but broken. Did you see her afterward? She sat on the stairs for nearly an hour, just sat, looking at nothing. I pretended I didn't see. Miss Marple remained quiet for a moment. Did she have visitors? Number. But there was a man who came by one day. Spoke to Miss Margaret at the gate. Tall, dark coat. He didn't come in. Did Evelyn know? I don't think so. But that night, she cried again quietly. Miss Marple nodded. In a house where silence carried more than words, someone had overheard everything and spoken of nothing. The partial document was discovered quite by accident. Margaret had been sorting Evelyn's things with the intent of sending them to a charity shop. In the drawer of her small escar, mostly filled with pressed flowers and worn stationery, lay the envelope, torn, not addressed, but unmistakably legal in appearance. Miss Marple, who had arrived bearing a basket of quince preserves, was asked to stay as Margaret unfolded the paper. "It's a copy," Margaret said. "Not original, but it's real." The will was brief, dated 2 years prior from a Mr. Lionel Setwin, retired merchant of Bombay. In it, he bequeathed a sum of £600 to Evelyn Ward, daughter of his late business partner, on the condition that she marry before her 25th birthday. Otherwise, the sum would revert to a distant cousin in Surrey. The document ended there. No signatures, no witnesses, but it was real enough to cast a long shadow. She never mentioned this, Margaret said. Her voice was level, but her hands gripped the paper tightly. Did she mention the cousin? Miss Marple asked. No. And the birthday never. Miss Marple took a breath. Do you know when her birthday was? Margaret hesitated. Number she never said. The will, though slight, was damning in its quiet implication. Evelyn's urgency, her sorrow, her silence, all now carried the weight of time, and a deadline she had not met. Miss Marple's next visit was to the local registrar's office, a place few entered unless born, wed, or deceased. She asked with polite formality for the birth record of Evelyn Ward. The Clare, a thin, well-organized woman with a fondness for precision, found it quickly. Born June 28, 1929. Miss Marple blinked. The fete had been held on June 27th. She died the day before, the Clare said, verifying the death certificate. Just shy of 25. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly. She thanked the Clare, stepped outside into the warmth, and took a long breath. It was not only the fact of the birthday, nor the inheritance, though both mattered. It was the timing, the sharp, bitter nearness. Evelyn had reached England with time to spare. She had taken a room, made no plans, avoided London, avoided letters. She had lived as though the clock were not counting down. But had it been? Miss Marple thought again of the letter from Hampshire, of the man at the gate, of 3 candles and an unposted envelope. She had seen too much to ignore it now. Evelyn had not merely failed to reach her birthday. She had been prevented from doing so. Captain Ambrose Lee was preparing to leave St. Mary, Maine. He had lingered longer than was practical, his business in London now pressing, and his grief dulled to a quiet ache rather than an open wound. Still there remained a persistent sense that he was departing with more questions than when he had arrived. It was as he packed his Val and the Modest in on the edge of the village that he noticed the latch, not broken, but askew, no longer flush with the leather casing. His boots were in a different order than he remembered, and his shaving kit had been unzipped. A book of poetry, which he had left under his shirts, now rested on top. It was not obvious, not even alarming, but something had been disturbed. He said nothing at first, but when Miss Marple passed him on the green that afternoon, he paused beside her as she examined a bed of marigolds outside the greengrocer's. "I believe someone's been in my room," he said quietly. She turned to him with polite interest. "And what was taken?" "Nothing I can see," he replied, which in a way makes it worse. Miss Marple did not press him in the street. Instead, she invited him for tea the following morning. Nothing formal, just a cup by the rose trellis. She brought out her better teapot and poured quietly while he looked out across the lawn with a faraway expression. There were letters, he said at last, from Evelyn, old ones. She sent them while she was still in Bombay. I kept them with me, not out of sentimentality, but they felt important. And now he shook his head. Gone. I didn't realize at first, but there were 5, folded together in a leather wallet. The wallet is still there, but the letters are gone. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her eyes cast downward. Were they intimate? Number not in the usual sense, but they spoke of things, fears, a man she was avoiding, her inheritance. She mentioned a cousin. Miss Marple looked up. Did she ever speak of Margaret? Only once, said she was kind, but lonely. Evelyn always noticed the lonely ones. Miss Marple nodded. And did the letters mention June? He hesitated. She wrote that she would need to act before her birthday. She never explained what that meant. The wind stirred the roses. Miss Marple thought of lost letters, of unspoken dread, and of a young woman clutching silence like armor. 2 days later, word reached Miss Marple from young Toby Withers, who had been playing cricket with his brother in the Topham's garden. The ball had rolled beneath the rhododendrons, and in crawling after it, Toby had unearthed something half buried in the dry soil. It was an envelope, crumpled, stained, and stuck to the earth as though it had been there for some time. The boy, curious and half expecting it to be rubbish, peeled it free. What caught his attention was the deep red smudge across the front. Ink perhaps, or something else. He brought it to his mother, who turned it over to the vicar, who in turn brought it solemnly to Miss Marple. The handwriting was unmistakably Aylin's. It had not been addressed. The flap had not been sealed. Inside there was a single folded sheet of paper, equally stained, the lines wavering, but legible. Miss Marple read it once, and did not speak for several minutes. Later she tucked it carefully into a linen envelope, and set it in the drawer beneath her pressed handkerchiefs. She thought of Ine in the garden that final afternoon, her parasol, the faintness, the stillness of her hands, and of something said in confidence that had never reached its destination. The letter, once seen by the constable, set off a chain of reaction more swift than Miss Marple had hoped. Its tone, its secrecy, and the implications therein were enough to stir the local authorities from respectful sympathy into procedural vigilance. Within the week, a maid named Dora Finch, formerly employed at the vicarage, but dismissed the previous year for petty theft, was taken into custody. Her reputation, though partially redeemed by her recent work at the Tophams, had never fully recovered. The discovery of the envelope near a house where she had served proved too tempting a connection for the police to ignore. "They say she was jealous," murmured Mrs. Price at the post office. Said Evelyn had replaced her, socially speaking, took her place. Miss Marple listened but said nothing. She had seen Dora briefly a few days before the Fed, a shy, dark-eyed girl, polite to a fault, and given more to retreat than confrontation. There had been nothing in her bearing to suggest bitterness, only the vague shame of someone trying very hard to be acceptable. The arrest was carried out quietly, but Miss Marple, watching from the parlor window as the girl was led away, could not shake the feeling that something was amiss, not in what had been done, but in what had been left unsaid. It was at the vicar's study, during a meeting convened by the inspector, that Miss Marple made her objections known, not through accusation, but through suggestion. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether the envelope could have been placed rather than dropped." The inspector frowned. "You believe the child planted it?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "But someone else might have. Children rarely notice the value of things unless told to look for them. And the ink. Red ink can be made from beetroot. Blood fades to brown. I rather think this was the former." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "And motive?" Miss Marple folded her hands. Evelyn was preparing to send something private. The letter was removed from her effects, and yet it was found, not burned, but buried. She changed her mind. Perhaps someone else did. But if one wished to remove suspicion from themselves and redirect it towards someone with a convenient reputation, she left the sentence unfinished. The inspector, though skeptical, agreed to pause the charge. Miss Marple, who never enjoyed being right, simply nodded and looked again at the envelope. The torn edge, the deliberate smudge. It was not a cry for help. It was a message never delivered. That evening, Miss Marple read the letter again. The lines were rushed, the ink uneven, and the paper watermarked with faint impressions of having been gripped too tightly. But the tone was not emotional. It was deliberate. "I write this to protect myself, should anything occur. I know what I discovered. She will not admit it, but I saw her face when I mentioned the name, the photo in the locket. She recognized it, not from me, but from a mirror. She has always known. I trusted her once, but I do not now. If I die, let this be read. There was no signature, but none was needed. The she was Margaret. The face in the locket was Evelyn's own, and the mirror, Miss Marple understood, was not a literal one. It had not been about money, not entirely. It had been about blood, kinship, inheritance not of estate but of history. If Evelyn's mother had been Margaret's as well, if the family secret had been whispered behind colonial curtains and returned to haunt a quiet English garden, then the motive was not simple jealousy. It was identity and fear. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it gently back. Evelyn had tried in the end to tell the truth, not through confrontation, but through precaution. She had chosen the pen instead of a quarrel, and someone had tried to bury it. But secrets buried beneath the rhododendron rarely stay hidden forever. The post office in St. Mary-Me was a modest affair, lined with predictable displays of stationery and seasonal postcards. Behind the counter stood Miss Luring, tidy, unmarried, alert to everything in her domain. She held the distinction of never having misplaced a parcel or forgotten a birthday. Miss Marple arrived mid-morning, wearing her gray gloves and carrying a small parcel of lemon biscuits. After polite inquiries into the state of the post van, she lowered her voice with gentle curiosity. "Did Miss Ward ever make use of post-restant services?" she asked as though the notion had only just occurred to her. Miss Luring blinked. "Number." She didn't ask for post-ant, but she did ask whether one might post a letter without it being noticed. Did she now? Miss Marple's tone remained warm. She inquired whether a letter could be franked somewhere outside the village. I explained we were quite standard in practice. Nothing scandalous in her manner, of course, but she looked well, not afraid, precisely concerned. Did she ever post that letter? I saw her place something in the outside box 2 days before the Fed, but it was small. Very small. Might have been a card. Miss Marple gave a soft, thoughtful nod. It was not the sending of the letter that had been important. It was the secrecy surrounding it, and what that need for secrecy implied. Her next stop was the parish church. She had often found answers among ledgers and dust rather than in declarations. The sacristan, Mr. Beechcraft, greeted her with his usual combination of curiosity and weariness. He was used to her questions, though not always to her conclusions. Miss Marple inquired, quite conversationally, whether the visitor's register might reveal anything useful about Evelyn Ward's habits. She came only once, he confirmed. Didn't write her name, but I remember her distinctly, quiet, alone. Stood in front of the Lady Chapel for nearly an hour. Did she light candles? 3, I believe. And she knelt, not in the usual way, more like she was gathering courage. Did she speak to anyone? Number. But she left an envelope tucked behind the hymnals. Found it after even song, blank, empty. Miss Marple took this in with a small nod. Did you keep it? Number thought it was a scrap, but now she did not press him. Some confessions, she thought, are made in writing and discarded unread. What mattered was not what had been confessed, but that she had felt the need to do so, and that someone may have seen her doing it. Dr. Partridge was not surprised to see her again. He had long learned that Miss Marple's questions, however mild, usually arrived in pairs. She declined his offer of tea, but accepted a chair and waited until the silence grew comfortable. You said Evelyn Ward had no history of illness, she began gently. Correct. But what of the symptoms at the fete? He leaned back. Collapse, weakness, no immediate signs of seizure or trauma. The heart was presumed. Presumed, she repeated, because no alternative suggested itself. There was one, he admitted, but it seemed unlikely. The onset was too subtle. Would you consider the effects of a natural poison? Dr. Partridge's brow furrowed. What sort? One used in herbal remedies, slower acting, something masked by cordial or tea. He considered foxglove perhaps? Belladonna in the wrong dose? All possible, but they usually show signs. Dilated pupils, dry mouth, hallucinations. Miss Marple folded her hands. And if the victim had been taking such a preparation unwittingly for several days, then it would be nearly undetectable without a formal post-mortem, which we did not have. No, she stood with a faint sigh. Thank you, doctor. You've confirmed precisely what I feared. She did not die suddenly. She was dying. Miss Marple had never been one for direct confrontation, but she had ways of drawing out knowledge that might otherwise remain locked away. Her conversation with Mrs. Bell, who kept a stall of country tonics at the monthly market, yielded more than a casual observer might expect. Yes, the woman said, I prepare elderflower cordial. Good for nerves and digestion, but I never sweeten with too much syrup. Ruins the bloom. Do you add anything to preserve it? Miss Marple asked. Drop of gentian. Sometimes a pinch of monks. Just trace amounts mind, but only if someone asks for it specially. Otherwise, I make it pure. Did you supply any recently to the vicarage? Mrs. Bell considered. Not directly, but Margaret Topham stopped by at the fete and took a small bottle I'd brought for judging. Said it reminded her of her mother's recipe. I thought nothing of it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Elderflower was delicate in taste, easily masking other notes, and monkshood annum was dangerous only in quantity or in repetition. It was not just about what was present in the cordial, she realized. It was about who had chosen to serve it and why. Miss Marple sat quietly in the shade of the parish green, recalling the church fete in its usual chaos of bunting, lemonade, and lightly competitive jam. Evelyn Ward had wandered alone, carrying a paper parasol, and stopped for a cordial beneath the archway. The stall had belonged to the Tophams, and the elderflower cordial had not come from the usual supplier. Mrs. Bantry had tasted it. Unusually bitter, she had remarked, though not unpleasant. Evelyn had drunk an entire cup, not with enthusiasm, but with dutiful politeness. Margaret Topham, for her part, had said later she'd found the cordial nostalgic, a childhood memory. Miss Marple remembered now the faint trace on Evelyn's lip, the way she'd touched her throat as though tasting something unexpected, and the hour that followed, her stillness, her pall, the parasol sagging. It was not sudden. It had begun there with that cup. The poison had not been strong. It had been repeated, served not as a weapon, but as a memory, a habit returned to under the guise of comfort, and Evelyn, so careful in all things, had not known. Or had she? In the stillness of her parlor, Miss Marple returned to the locket. The photograph of a child beside a turned-away woman had haunted her from the start, not for what it showed, but for what it withheld. The woman's face had been deliberately obscured. The child had Evelyn's expression, but it was the fabric on the woman's shoulder, a faint rose-patterned muslin that now stood out. Miss Marple had seen it before in an old photograph at the vicarage. One Margaret Topham had once shown her in passing, claiming it was her mother taken before Margaret's own birth. The same pattern, the same pose. And suddenly, Evelyn's veiled words about being part of something unspoken made sense. If Evelyn's mother had once been in service in the same household, if there had been a liaison, a shame, and a child passed quietly into other arrangements, then Margaret and Evelyn were not strangers. They were family, half-sisters. Miss Marple let the thought settle. The poison had not been rage. It had been resentment cultivated over years. Margaret, the beautiful niece, the always proper daughter, had watched Evelyn, her mirror and rival, step unknowing into her life, and Evelyn, perhaps unaware at first, had come to suspect the truth. The letter in the garden had not accused. It had revealed, and the cordial. It had been a way to keep things quiet, not murder and malice, but in refusal, in the deep English habit of not letting the past disturb the drawing room. Miss Marple looked out at the roses. Evelyn had died of poison, but the poison had been prepared not in haste, but in a lifetime of being told over and over what she could not be. The vicar's parlor, with its worn Persian rug and faint scent of polish, had seen many parish discussions, but never quite like this one. Margaret Topham sat nearest the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression composed, if a touch pale. Captain Lee stood by the fireplace, weary and guarded, his eyes occasionally flickering toward the hearth. Mrs. Bantry, uninvited but welcomed, occupied a modest chair near the sideboard, her gaze alight with restrained curiosity. Miss Marple sat at the center, her knitting unopened beside her teacup, her expression as mild as always. She did not pace nor raise her voice. She simply folded her hands and began to speak. "I thank you all for coming," she said. "I know we have all felt the weight of Evelyn Ward's death, but what I must say now may be difficult to hear." No one interrupted. Even Margaret inclined her head faintly, as if to signal that one might as well get on with it. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "The truth, I find, is rarely loud. It arrives quietly when one sees what has always been visible, but never truly examined." And with that, she began to tell the story, calmly, precisely, as only Miss Marple could. She came here alone. Miss Marple continued, a girl who spoke little, who carried no handbag, who appeared to belong nowhere. We accepted her story. India, a dead father, a friend in Margaret. But there was more beneath the silence. She looked at Margaret, who had gone quite still. Evelyn was illegitimate. Her mother was once a servant in the same household where Margaret's mother lived as the lady of the house. There had been an arrangement. A shame covered over sent abroad. It is not an uncommon story, but the effects of such a story when lived in silence are profound. Captain Lee spoke low and shocked. She never told me. She wouldn't have, Miss Marple replied. Children born under shame rarely do. But the need to belong, to find stability, to be acknowledged, drives deeper than pride. She let the silence settle, then added softly, Evelyn did not seek vengeance. She sought recognition, not from society, but from her sister. Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she did not speak. It was not merely personal. Miss Marple continued, addressing no one and everyone. There was a practical reason as well, a will, an inheritance from a former associate of her father's. The money was modest, but conditional. She turned toward Captain Lee. She told you, did she not, that her birthday was soon? Yes, he replied, but she wouldn't explain why it mattered. Because it was the final condition. Miss Marple said she was to marry before her 25th birthday. Otherwise the money would be lost to a distant cousin. Evelyn returned to England, took a room with Margaret, and made no immediate effort to marry. Why? No one answered. So Miss Marple did, because the money mattered less to her than being seen, being acknowledged. It was not about wealth. It was about legitimacy to belong in this country, in a family, in a name. She let her words fall gently like petals. But someone else had something to lose if the truth came out. She was not killed in haste. Miss Marple said softly. She was poisoned over time using something familiar hidden within elderflower cordial. It was not bitter enough to alert her, but it was persistent, slow, cruel. She turned very slightly toward Margaret. You served the cordial. You took it from the Fed. You offered it daily in small, harmless, seeming cups, and she trusted you. Margaret said nothing. Her hands had not moved. You did not rage. You did not accuse. But Evelyn's presence forced you to see something in yourself you had buried long ago. Still Margaret said nothing, but her eyes had narrowed. You were the good daughter, the beautiful one, and she was born of silence. Yet she stood beside you with the same blood in her veins. Miss Marple's voice dropped, and you could not bear it. There was a letter, Miss Marple continued, written on the eve of Evelyn's death, not addressed, not sealed, but buried, found later in the garden. She looked toward the vicar's desk, where the envelope now rested. It spoke not of blame, but of truth. She had begun to suspect. She saw Margaret's face when the locket was found. She recognized the same features, the same silence. Mrs. Bantry stirred. Then she meant to send it. She did. Or perhaps she meant to leave it. But it was taken, hidden, and later, when suspicion grew, it was planted to shift blame to a maid with a convenient past. There was no outburst, no protest. Margaret's gaze dropped to the edge of the rug. She never accused, Miss Marple said quietly. She only asked to be remembered for what she was, for who she was, her sister. Miss Marple held the locket delicately in her gloved hand. You all recall it, she said. Found near the fete grounds. No inscription, no name, just a photograph of a child and a woman. Her face turned away. She opened it, facing it toward Margaret. This fabric, she said, matches the muslin worn by your mother in the portrait by the staircase. Margaret's face did not move, but her breath caught only slightly. It is not unusual for a household to hide what they must, but children remember, even when they do not understand. And Evelyn, I believe, remembered that woman's scent, the curve of her shoulder, the hush in the nursery when guests came. She closed the locket. You did not mean to kill her. Not at first, but when she suspected, when she began to write, you acted not out of hatred, but out of fear, out of resentment, that your life, carefully composed, might be rewritten by a girl who had never been given your name. Margaret stood slowly. Her face was calm, but pale as glass. She had everything handed to her, she whispered, and still she came expecting more. No, Miss Marple replied gently. She had nothing, and she came only hoping to be seen. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Margaret Topham, the vicer's niece, walked to the hearth, placed her hand upon the mantel and said, "I think I should like to sit down." And no one stopped her. The ground behind the church was soft with late summer, the grass curling slightly at the edges, where dew met shadow. Miss Marple knelt with care, her knees cushioned by a folded cloth, her gloved hands holding a small spade and a pot containing a single rose cutting. Compassion, a dusky blush-cold bloom. She dug slowly, not out of frailty, but with a deliberate gentleness, as though not to disturb the air itself. The new rose took its place beside the older stones, where names had weathered into quiet anonymity. The cutting had been selected not for color, nor origin, but for memory. Evelyn Ward's grave had no family to tend it, no sister to bring flowers, only the plain inscription added by the parish, "A guest taken too soon." Miss Marple stood when it was done. She did not speak nor pray aloud, but she laid her hand briefly on the headstone and nodded. It was not justice she offered, nor even forgiveness. It was remembrance, something Evelyn had longed for, and now in this small act quietly received. Later that week Miss Marple took tea with the vicar in the rectory garden. The sundial, a gift from a forgotten benefactor, cast a narrow shadow over the table. The day was cool, the tea warm, and the silence between sips unhurried. She left so little behind, the vicar said quietly, and yet we speak of her more than some who lived here for years. Miss Marple stirred her tea. It's not always the length of one's stay that marks a place. Sometimes it's what one disturbs merely by being present. She disturbed Margaret. She revealed Margaret to herself. Miss Marple said gently, "That is far more painful." The vicar nodded, his brow furrowed. "Do you think it was hate?" "No," she replied. "I think it was hunger, not for money, nor admiration, but for a sense of worth too long denied." Evelyn never demanded anything. No, Miss Marple agreed. She merely existed, and in doing so made others confront things they had buried. They sat quietly after that. The wind moved lightly through the apple trees. Somewhere a bell rang the half-hour, and Miss Marple, gazing past the sundial, seemed to be measuring something, not in time, but in understanding. When the tea was finished and the shadows lengthened, Miss Marple rose to leave. She paused, her hand resting briefly on the garden gate, then turned back to the vicar. "It's quite often not wickedness, you know," she said softly. "Not really. It's the loneliness that's what is it more often than not." The vicar said nothing but inclined his head. Miss Marple looked toward the churchyard, where a single rose now bloomed among the stones. Loneliness distorts. It hardens. And if left too long, it teaches people to fear what might have once saved them. Connection, humility, tenderness. She smiled gently. But even then, sometimes we can still plant something that will bloom where silence had grown. And with that she left the garden, her steps slow but certain, her thoughts already settling once more into the rhythms of village life. Some endings arrive not with thunder, but with the soft rustle of petals falling on a grave, in the quiet of St. Mary, where gossip blooms like wisteria and pain often hides behind perfectly steeped tea. Justice came gently, not with punishment alone, but with understanding. Miss Marple did not accuse. She observed, and in doing so she laid bare a truth more enduring than guilt. That loneliness, silent and slow, confessed her into tragedy when left unseen. Evelyn Ward never raised her voice. She never shouted her story, but in the end it was heard in a letter, in a locket, in the memories she left behind. And Margaret Topham, so prim and proper, was not wicked in the usual sense, merely forgotten, invisible, and sometimes that is what hurts the most. So, dear listener, here's something to ponder. What do you think hurts more? Never being seen, or seeing too late what you've lost? And if you were in Margaret's place, would you have done differently?